So I am just back from a memorial service in Washington that brought people together from both sides of the political aisle. And if that sounds surprising to you, it is. Today, we have a mashup of two of our negotiation series, The Great Negotiator and Negotiation in the News. Let's go. So picture me on Monday morning sitting in this room with two former American presidents, with Governor Sarah Palin, with news personalities ranging from Peter Doocy to Judy Woodruff to Bob Woodward of Watergate fame. That's the scene for the memorial event for the great Bob Barnett. Now, if you are wondering who Bob Barnett is, let me tell you, this is the guy who was the representative who cut the book deal, the $15 million book deal for Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. But he didn't just work for the Obamas. He also cut the book deal for George W. Bush and Laura Bush. Oh, yes, and he also negotiated the book deal for Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. Add to the roster Queen Noor of Jordan, Prime Minister Tony Blair of the UK, and yes, even Pope Benedict. Bob Barnett is one of the greatest negotiators to ever live. And I am fortunate enough to say that he is one of my mentors. I met him way, way back in 1993 when I was working for his spouse, CBS News correspondent Rita Braver. Bob was not only a great negotiator, he was also an incredible mentor, someone who impacted my life tremendously. In fact, he's part of the reason why I ultimately decided to attend Harvard Law School. So I'm not going to wax sentimental about Bob Barnett. Instead, I'm going to share with you today 6 key qualities that made Bob Barnett a great negotiator and a great person. Number 1, always be prepared. Bob Barnett was one of the most prepared negotiators. In fact, if you spoke with him, he would always say, be more prepared than your counterparty. And really great negotiators, they don't go in and wing it, but they sit there and they think about in advance, what are the relevant norms? What are my interests? What are the other side's interests? What are our alternatives? What are their alternatives? Preparation is critical in negotiation. The second key quality that really marked Bob Barnett and any really great negotiator is perspective taking. One of the reasons why presidents from Barack Obama to George W. Bush to Bill Clinton, among others, people like Barbara Streisand or Tony Blair would look to Bob Barnett, was that he was able to provide this counsel in really complicated conflicts and negotiations that encompassed what the world looked like from the other's perspective. In fact, from 1984 to 2016, when the Democratic candidate for president was practicing for debates, it was Bob Barnett who would actually play the role of the Republican. And that's because he was widely known as being so good at representing and understanding the perspective of the other side. The third quality, and this is a quality that I so admire that Bob Barnett had, was say what you mean and mean what you say. One of the reasons why publishers, news networks, movie houses loved to work with Bob Barnett was because they knew that you could take his word to the bank. And that is such a really important skill in negotiation. It doesn't mean being wholly trusting, but it does mean be wholly trustworthy. The next quality is one that I really admire and that I think sometimes people really misconstrue. And it's the difference between being tough and being fair. And Bob Barnett was a tough negotiator, but he was also a fair negotiator. So What does that mean for you? Well, it means from a negotiation perspective, when you are preparing, always try to identify that criteria that is most in your favor and understand really, really well what your bottom lines are, what your red lines are. Understand really well what your principles are, what your ethics are, and what your values are, and then stay rooted in those. Don't get emotional. Don't lose sight of them. Be tough about them, but also be fair, because it's not a good outcome if you take the other side to the cleaners and the first time there's a disagreement about some provision of what you've agreed to, they feel so taken advantage of that they want to undermine the credibility and the longevity of the agreement. And people really do admire negotiators who are quite firm and have high aspiration values, but also care about getting something that's respectable and defensible for all sides in the negotiation. So here's the thing, right? When you push someone beyond what's fair, maybe you get a short term yes, but they're going to spend all of their time trying to figure out how to get back at you. They're going to hold a grudge and how to get out of that agreement. And so, what made Bob Barnett so good was that people really never looked back and said, hey, you know, I did agree to that $15 million advance with the Obamas, but I regret it. People knew that if Bob was driving for a particular outcome, that it was defensible and that it would accrue ultimately to the benefit of all sides. So, the fifth quality, a quality that I really admire in Bob, is always show discretion and never lie. So, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the really big jokes at this memorial service was that the person who could have written the most tell all book in all of Washington, D.C. was Bob Barnett himself. And that's because folks on every side of the political aisle came to him with their biggest problems, with their biggest challenges, and with their biggest opportunities. But why did they do that? It's because he was a lawyer's lawyer. He could hold confidences in a way that almost nobody else could, particularly in a city where leaks are all over. But the other thing about him was that he would never lie to you. He would never make something up. He was not a king of gossip. He was a king of discretion. And really good negotiators know exactly what information they're able to disclose and what information they shouldn't disclose, and they don't lie. The last piece of advice here that I learned from Bob Barnett is to value the relationship. Because here's what's really amazing, right? Bob worked with all of these luminaries. But you know what else was really amazing? I met this guy in 1993. And guess what? I'm not a luminary. But he maintained a mentoring relationship with me for all of those years. In fact, as many of you know, I wrote a book called Conflict Resilience that came out in March of this past year. And even around the negotiation for the publication of that book, Bob was there for me. Every year I write a holiday letter, and the first person who would respond was Bob Barnett. Bob Barnett had this famous joke. He actually had these Rolodexes, actual old-fashioned Rolodexes. And when somebody suggested to him that he maybe should put all those numbers into his phone, he said, I think the phone will be too heavy then. The point here, right, is that really good negotiators, they maintain relationships, they stay connected, they reach out, they remember what's important to people. So this past Monday was a sad day for me, but sitting here today, I'm so happy to be able to share these 6 really, really valuable lessons from my mentor, the great Bob Barnett. So let's review those 6 lessons. First, prepare, prepare, prepare. 2, always take the time to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, perspective taking. 3, say what you mean and mean what you say. Your integrity really matters. 4, be tough, but also care about getting an outcome that is fair for you and fair for all the other parties. 5, show discretion, be responsible, don't be a gossip, and never lie. And then lastly, build and maintain relationships. They make all the difference. For more on how to make a difference as a negotiator, keep watching my channel, subscribe here, and I'll see you next time. Want to be a better negotiator? Watch this next video.